Sheet Metal Training 3.8 Seams and Sealants. Once in the data file, select the Seams and Sealants page. And again, you are only available to have 22 seams. The first column is the description, where you can put in a generic description of what this seam type is going to be. This is the seam that is available in the pressure file as well as in the takeoff screen. Light allowance, you will put in a male and female material allowance as well as a feet per hour. The change gauge is dictating that at this gauge we will now start using the heavy allowances for the male, female, and feet per hour. Using Pittsburgh as our example, we can carry this across. The male allowance is 1/4 of an inch, the female is 1 inch in order to create the seam, and the machine will turn those seams at 240 feet per hour. At 20 gauge, however, we're going to use a large Pittsburgh or heavy Pittsburgh, which is going to be 3/8 and then 1 inch and 3/8, and it's at 100 feet per hour. There is no prep labor, there is no price per foot. The minimum gauge we're going to use it on is 28 and the maximum is 10. In other words, wide open to the program. If you wish to dictate that you do not want to use this seam on anything heavier than 16 gauge, simply put in the 16 and that'll be the maximum gauge allowed. Snap lock seam, 3/8, inch and 3/8, 300 square feet per hour. Change gauge is 10. In other words, we're not using a heavy allowance, and we can put in the maximum gauge for snap lock is 22 gauge. The program will now not allow 20 gauge to use a snap lock seam. Spot welded, a 1/2 inch overlap, 160 feet per hour, and then the price per foot is 1/2 penny. We have this set up so that it'll include a little bit of money for the actual waste of the tip as you're doing your spot welding. You can see welded has nothing set up except for a little bit of prep labor, and that's because welding is usually a butt weld or an angle weld, therefore there is no overlapping of the metal. It's not like a Pittsburgh where we're going to have metal that's going to overlap and cause us to have an actual seam set up. The actual labor for the welding will be taken care of in the seam sealant section. Looking at the bottom, you'll see that there's 3 buttons: seam sealants, per seam setup, and assembled labor. Let's start with seam sealants. The seam sealants page allows us to dictate what sealants are going to be allowed with each of the individual seams. The very first one listed is duct sealer, and we can see that the price per foot is 12 cents. The feet per hour that we can apply it is 285 feet per hour. The price per foot is calculated based on the number of lineal feet of coverage per gallon. If you look to the right, you'll see that we added in what are the national averages. Average coverage for duct sealer is 150 feet. So if your gallon costs $20, divide it by 150 feet, and that is your price per square foot. Price per foot. Same for the caulking, same for the silicone caulking. The hard cast foil grip tape, 3 inches by 100 foot, so that you can divide the cost out. Let's go back to the seams, and now we can use per seam setup. This is where we will select the seams on the left-hand side and check the sealants that we wish to allow with each of these individual seams. By doing this setup ahead of time, it will eliminate the possibility of mistakes later in the takeoff screen. Let's go back to seams and select the assembled labor. Seam assembly is typically done in the shop or in the field. If you are a contractor that assembles your duct in the shop, you can put in labor to assemble standard length duct for Pittsburgh seams and snap lock seams. However, if you do your assembly in the field, you will want to leave these columns 0 so that we don't have any additional shop labor added. Let's go back to seams. This will conclude the walkthrough of the seams and sealants page.